What happened in that single operational night was not just another missile exchange in the Middle East. It was not another headline, not another dramatic clip for social media, and not another round of empty political language from governments trying to control the narrative after the damage has already been done. What happened was a military event that exposed the weakness of assumptions Israel and Washington have been selling for years. Iran launched a large-scale missile campaign across the depth of Israeli military infrastructure, and the purpose was not simply to create explosions. The purpose was to attack the system that allows a modern military to function: bases, fuel depots, ammunition storage, command centers, radar sites, runway systems, air defense nodes, logistics hubs. These are not symbolic targets. These are the organs of a military machine. When those organs are hit at the same time, the question is no longer whether a building is still standing or whether a spokesman can appear on television and say the situation is under control. The question becomes whether that military can still move, shoot, refuel, communicate, repair, reinforce, and sustain itself under combat pressure. And by the end of this analysis, you will understand why this is not just about missiles or bases. This is about credibility, deterrence, intelligence failure, logistical collapse, and the consequences of strategic arrogance. The first thing people need to understand is that an operation of this scale does not happen by luck. Iran did not wake up one morning and randomly fire missiles at dots on a map. That is how television commentators describe war when they do not understand targeting, logistics, or operational planning. A real strike campaign begins long before the first missile leaves the launcher. It begins with intelligence preparation. It begins with mapping the enemy's military nervous system. Where is the fuel stored? Where are the ammunition bunkers? Where are the radar arrays? Where are the command facilities? Which aircraft shelters matter? Which roads feed the base? Which runways must be hit to prevent flight operations? Which depots support forward units? Which installations are essential for air operations and which are essential for ground logistics? These are not casual questions. These are the questions serious military planners answer before they build a strike package. If the targeting is precise, then the attacker had more than satellite photographs. He had a picture of how the military system worked. That picture is not built from one source. Satellite imagery can show structures, but it does not always explain function. Signals intelligence can reveal communication patterns, but it does not always show the physical layout of a facility. Human intelligence can identify routines and vulnerabilities, but it must be verified. Commercial imagery, transport data, aircraft movement patterns, fuel truck activity, radar emissions, maintenance cycles, base expansion work, even public construction traces can contribute to a targeting database. When missiles hit specific functional points inside a military installation, it tells you something important. It tells you the attacker understood what mattered. Hitting open ground is not the same as hitting fuel storage. Hitting the perimeter is not the same as hitting command and control. Hitting a symbolic building is not the same as disabling an airbase. The impact pattern matters. The sequence matters. The target selection matters. And what emerges here is not chaos, it is deliberate military planning. For years, Israeli officials and Western analysts treated Iran's missile capability as serious but manageable. They admitted Iran had missiles, they admitted Iran had drones, they admitted Iran had regional reach, but they continued to assume that Israel's layered air defense system, backed by American intelligence and American resupply, would contain the damage. That assumption has now been tested at scale, and scale is the point. One missile is a tactical problem. 10 missiles are a defensive challenge. 100 missiles create stress, but a coordinated large-scale strike arriving on multiple axes aimed at functional military infrastructure is a different problem entirely. Air defense is not magic. It is mathematics, radar coverage, interceptor availability, command and control speed, engagement geometry, reload cycles, and human decision-making under pressure. Every one of those elements has limits. When the attacker designs the operation to exceed those limits, even advanced systems can fail to protect the operational function they were meant to defend. This is where the official story begins to fall apart. You will hear officials talk about interceptions. You will hear commentators repeat phrases like successful defense, limited damage, and resilience, but serious analysis does not stop at interception claims. The real question is not whether some missiles were intercepted. Of course, some missiles were intercepted. The real question is whether enough missiles were intercepted to prevent operational consequences. If runways are cratered, if fuel infrastructure burns, if ammunition depots detonate, if radar sites go dark, if command facilities are damaged, then the defensive system did not achieve its strategic purpose. It may have reduced the damage. It did not stop the attacker from shaping the battlefield. That difference matters. Tactical defensive activity is not the same as strategic success. The strike logic in this type of campaign is straightforward. First, stress the defensive network. Second, degrade radar and command systems. Third, hit the offensive infrastructure, especially air bases and missile-related facilities. Fourth, attack the logistics system that allows recovery and continued operations. That is not emotional retaliation. That is operational design. The point is not simply to punish. The point is to reduce the enemy's ability to function as a coherent military force. That is why this is so dangerous for Israel. A military can survive damaged buildings. It cannot easily survive the simultaneous disruption of its air operations, ammunition distribution, fuel supply, and command structure. Take an air base. Most people see aircraft and assume that is the whole story. It is not. Aircraft are only combat power if the base can generate sorties. To generate sorties, the base needs runways, taxiways, maintenance crews, fuel systems, weapons loading areas, communications, radar coverage, fire suppression, spare parts, secure storage, and functioning command authority. If enough of those elements are hit, aircraft may still physically exist, but the base no longer functions as a combat platform. This is how modern air power can be degraded without destroying every aircraft on the ground. You hit the system that allows aircraft to fight. You hit the fuel, you hit the weapons storage, you hit the runways, you hit the maintenance capacity, you hit command and control. You force the enemy to spend days, weeks, or even months trying to restore basic function while his operational tempo collapses. At a base tied to high-value aircraft operations, the meaning becomes even more severe. If radar and fire control nodes are struck first, then aircraft infrastructure, then fuel and runway systems. That tells you the attacker understood sequence. Disable defense before attacking offense, damage recovery capacity before the enemy can reorganize, force the defender to solve 10 emergencies at once. That is how serious strike planning works. It is not random fire. It is pressure applied against the structure that keeps the enemy force alive. The same principle applies to logistics. A modern army is not sustained by courage, ideology, or political speeches. Tanks do not move because a prime minister gives a press conference. Artillery does not fire because a spokesman says morale is high. Infantry units do not hold positions because television anchors declare victory. Armies fight because ammunition, fuel, food, water, spare parts, medical supplies, batteries, and repair equipment keep moving. The soldiers at the front are only the visible end of a long chain. If that chain breaks behind them, the front does not collapse instantly. It begins to degrade. And that is exactly why weak analysts miss the real danger. They look at deployed troops and say, they are still there. Yes, they are still there. The question is whether they can still be sustained. If hundreds of thousands of troops are deployed across active fronts and the logistics architecture behind them is damaged, that is not a tactical inconvenience. That is a strategic crisis. Forward units carry limited supplies. They have ammunition on hand. They have fuel in vehicles. They may have food for several days, but combat consumption is brutal. High-intensity operations burn through ammunition at a rate civilians do not understand. Tank rounds, artillery shells, mortar rounds, anti-tank missiles, machine gun belts, interceptor missiles, engineering charges, medical supplies. These are consumed by the ton. Once resupply becomes uncertain, commanders begin rationing. That is the first sign of operational decline. Ammunition rationing changes everything. Artillery support becomes limited. Anti-tank missiles are reserved for confirmed targets. Suppressive fire decreases. Patrols become more cautious. Defensive positions stretch thin. Offensive movement slows. Commanders stop acting with confidence and start conserving. Soldiers feel that immediately. They know when artillery support is no longer routine. They know when supply trucks stop arriving on schedule. They know when ammunition is being counted instead of issued freely. Morale is not an abstract concept. It is tied to whether the soldier believes the system behind him still works. When that belief breaks, battlefield behavior changes before any official announcement is made. Fuel is even more unforgiving. A tank without fuel is not a maneuver weapon. It is a stationary object waiting to be targeted. Mechanized forces require constant fuel. Tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, command vehicles, ambulances, recovery vehicles, artillery movers, air defense launchers, engineering vehicles, generators, all of them consume fuel. If fuel depots are destroyed or distribution is disrupted, commanders face brutal choices. Stay in place and risk being fixed by the enemy, or move and consume the fuel needed for later survival. This is how options shrink, not because soldiers refuse to fight, but because the physical basis for fighting has been attacked. Food and medical supply problems emerge more slowly, but they compound the crisis. Troops can operate on carried rations for a limited period, but not indefinitely. Medical evacuation becomes harder when transport and fuel are constrained. Spare parts matter because vehicles break even when they are not hit. Communications equipment needs batteries, sensors need power, field hospitals need supplies. War is sustainment. Whoever understands sustainment understands the real clock of the battlefield, and the clock does not care about propaganda. This is why the condition of large deployed formations matters more than the physical destruction of individual bases. A destroyed base is visible. A collapsing logistic system is less visible but more decisive. You can photograph a crater. You cannot easily show the moment when a brigade commander realizes he cannot maintain fire rates for another 72 hours. You cannot easily show the moment when fuel officers tell commanders movement must be restricted. You cannot easily show the moment when the air defense unit begins calculating which incoming threats it can afford not to engage. But those moments decide wars. Iran's strategy here is not based on defeating every Israeli unit in direct battle. That is not the point. The point is exhaustion. Iran is pursuing the systematic degradation of Israel's capacity and will to continue fighting at the tempo it prefers. This is not a second choice strategy because Iran lacks imagination. It is a deliberate strategy shaped by an understanding of Israel's vulnerabilities. Israel is a small country with a very capable but very expensive military. It depends heavily on reserves. It depends on rapid mobilization. It depends on American support. It depends on functioning air power. It depends on public confidence. It depends on the belief that wars will remain short enough for the system to absorb. An exhaustion strategy attacks all of those assumptions. Stay with this, because the next layer is where the official story becomes much more uncomfortable. Israel's military culture has historically favored rapid, decisive action. Strike hard, strike fast, control escalation, dominate the skies, disrupt the enemy, and end the conflict before the long-term costs begin to bite. That model can work against weaker opponents with limited capacity for sustained response. It does not work the same way against an adversary that is prepared for endurance. Iran has spent decades under sanctions, pressure, sabotage, covert action, military threats, and diplomatic isolation. Western analysts often interpreted this as pure weakness. But that pressure also forced Iran to build redundancy, dispersal, domestic production, missile depth, and strategic patience. In other words, the conditions meant to keep Iran weak helped shape the kind of military posture that now makes it difficult to coerce. This is the strategic contradiction Washington does not want to discuss. The United States and its allies built a regional security architecture around the assumption that American power could deter major escalation, protect allies, secure energy routes, and dominate every rung of the escalation ladder. But deterrence depends on credibility. Credibility depends on whether the adversary believes the threat. If Iran demonstrates that it can strike deep military infrastructure at scale despite Israeli defenses and American support, then the credibility equation changes. Every regional government notices. Gulf capitals notice. Moscow notices. Beijing notices. NATO notices. Resistance movements notice. They are not listening to press conferences. They are studying outcomes. Washington's first instinct in a crisis like this is information control. What happened? What can be confirmed? What must be denied? What can be delayed? Then comes options development. Can the United States resupply Israel? Can it move interceptors? Can it reinforce air defense? Can it reposition naval assets? Can it hit Iranian launch infrastructure? Can it threaten without acting? Can it act without triggering a regional war? And then comes the real question, the question political leaders hate. What is the cost? Because support in principle is easy. Support under fire is harder. Support that risks a regional war with Iran is something else entirely. The emergency resupply option looks simple only to people who do not understand logistics. Yes, the United States can fly in ammunition. It can send interceptors. It can move spare parts. It can surge equipment. But airlift does not magically restore a damaged logistics system. Supplies must land at functioning airfields. They must be unloaded, sorted, stored, secured, and moved forward. That requires runways, cargo handling equipment, fuel systems, transport vehicles, roads, drivers, communications, and command coordination. If the receiving infrastructure is damaged or overloaded, throughput collapses. You can deliver some supplies. You cannot instantly replace the entire system required to sustain hundreds of thousands of troops in active operations. That is the point. American capacity is enormous, but capacity must be delivered into reality. Distance matters, infrastructure matters, enemy strike capability matters, political permission matters, airfield capacity matters, port security matters, fuel distribution matters. If Iran can hit Israeli infrastructure, it can also threaten American bases in the region. U.S. facilities in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere are not immune to precision strike. Direct American intervention against Iranian territory would not happen in a vacuum. It would trigger Iranian response options across the region. That does not mean Washington cannot act. It means action carries consequences that serious planners cannot ignore. The Strait of Hormuz adds another level of danger. Iran does not need to permanently close the strait to create global economic shock. It only needs to make the risk credible enough to affect shipping, insurance, energy pricing, and market psychology. Energy markets respond to risk before full disruption occurs. A credible threat in Hormuz affects inflation, transport costs, industrial output, food prices, and political stability far beyond the Middle East. Europe feels it. Asia feels it. The developing world feels it. American consumers feel it. That is why a war with Iran is not just a military question. It is an economic and political question for the entire global system. Carrier strike groups illustrate the dilemma perfectly. For decades, U.S. carriers have been presented as symbols of overwhelming power. Move a carrier group into the region, and the assumption is that deterrence has arrived. But carriers are not magic symbols. They are military platforms operating in an environment shaped by anti-ship missiles, drones, submarines, satellites, long-range sensors, and precision strike systems. If a carrier moves too close, it becomes vulnerable. If it stays too far away, its operational effectiveness and political signaling decline. That is the contradiction. The carrier must be close enough to intimidate, but far enough to survive. Every serious military planner understands this, even if television analysts pretend otherwise. This is why the American message to Israel becomes complicated. Washington can say the alliance is strong, it can say support continues, it can provide intelligence, ammunition, interceptors, and diplomatic cover, but direct American military engagement against Iran is not a simple button to press. It risks U.S. casualties, it risks strikes on American bases, it risks energy shock, it risks regional war, it risks escalation that cannot be neatly controlled. Israel has built much of its security architecture around the assumption that American backing is ultimately unconditional, but no backing is truly unconditional when the price becomes a war that Washington cannot confidently contain. The conditions were always there. The crisis simply makes them visible. And this is where the intelligence picture becomes darker. If Israel continues offensive operations, it consumes remaining stocks faster. If it shifts to defense, it concedes initiative. If it withdraws, it pays political and psychological costs. If it escalates, it risks dragging the United States into a larger war. If it waits, Iran gains time to apply more pressure. None of these choices produce a clean victory. That is what a successful strategic strike campaign does. It does not merely destroy things, it reduces the enemy's options until every path carries risk. Iran's doctrine of exhaustion is specifically designed for this. Tehran is not trying to fight Israel on Israel's preferred timeline. It is not seeking a short war that can be decided by air power and American resupply. It is playing a longer game. It seeks to make each additional day of conflict more expensive politically, militarily, economically, and psychologically. It seeks to force Israel to mobilize reserves for longer than planned. It seeks to make air defense consume interceptors. It seeks to pressure fuel and ammunition. It seeks to show Israeli civilians that strategic depth is limited. It seeks to show Washington that support has costs. This is not random escalation. It is pressure applied through time, through the follow-on phase would not have to involve one massive strike every night. That is not how exhaustion works. Iran can preserve capability, apply selective pressure, force constant alert, and keep the defender uncertain. Which base is next? Which logistics hub is vulnerable? Which airfield can still receive cargo? Which ship is too close? Which U.S. facility is within range? Which economic target matters most? Uncertainty itself becomes a weapon. It forces the defender to spread resources, elevate readiness, consume interceptors, move assets, and make decisions under stress. The attacker does not need to fire constantly if the threat of firing forces the enemy to live under permanent strain. Russia will study this closely. Moscow will look at the performance of missile systems, saturation tactics, air defense stress, and Western-backed military vulnerability. Any Russian-linked technology, doctrine, or operational concept that appears validated in such a scenario gains strategic value. It affects arms markets. It affects diplomatic relationships. It affects perceptions of Western vulnerability. Beijing will study it even more carefully. China is not interested in emotional reactions. It studies patterns. How does Washington respond when an ally is hit hard? What risks does it avoid? How quickly can it resupply? How cautious does it become when its bases are vulnerable? How do carriers behave under missile threat? How does domestic politics shape escalation? These lessons matter far beyond the Middle East. The global South will draw conclusions as well. For decades, many governments were told that alignment with Washington meant protection. They were told American-backed systems provided security. They were told U.S. power could deter adversaries and guarantee stability. But guarantees are judged by performance. If a heavily supported ally can suffer serious military disruption and Washington still faces hard limits, other states will adjust. They will hedge, they will diversify partnerships, they will look toward Russia, China, regional blocs, and independent defense options. Multipolarity does not arrive only through speeches. It arrives when events reveal the boundaries of old power. The media will try to simplify this into a clean story. They will talk about who won the night. They will show explosions. They will repeat official statements. They will focus on emotional images and political rhetoric. But serious analysis requires discipline. The real questions are operational. Which bases remain functional? Which depots survived? How many interceptors were consumed? How many days of ammunition remain for forward units? How much fuel can still be moved? Which roads are secure? Which airfields can receive American cargo? Which radar systems are degraded? Which commanders are asking for reinforcement or withdrawal? These questions decide the war. Not slogans, not press releases, not patriotic speeches. The most important lesson here is that modern war punishes arrogance. Israel assumed technological superiority and American support would preserve freedom of action. Washington assumed its regional architecture would deter any adversary from striking at scale. Western analysts assumed Iran's military capability could be contained within familiar limits. Each assumption is now under pressure. Iran has built a strategy around missiles, drones, dispersal, redundancy, regional depth, and patience. It does not need to mirror the American military model. It only needs to exploit the vulnerabilities of that model. That is what mature asymmetric strategy looks like. If this crisis continues, the question will not be whether Israel has remaining military capability. It does. The question will be whether that capability can be sustained at the level required to restore deterrence. The question will not be whether America can send supplies. It can. The question will be whether supply can restore a damaged operational architecture quickly enough. The question will not be whether Iran can be hit. It can. The question will be what happens after Iran is hit. That is the part reckless voices never answer. They call for escalation as if escalation is a controlled instrument. It is not. Once American bases are hit, once energy routes are threatened, once regional allies are pressured, once casualties begin, political leaders discover that war has its own momentum. This is why bad policy decisions are so dangerous. They are often made by people who believe their own narratives. They believe the enemy is weaker than he is. They believe allies are stronger than they are. They believe technology solves strategy. They believe public relations can cover operational failure. They believe limited strikes remain limited because Washington says so. That is not how war works. War exposes illusions. It strips away talking points. It measures capability in fuel, ammunition, runway repair, interceptor stocks, morale, and political endurance. The final warning is simple. This is the kind of moment where strategic miscalculation can become regional catastrophe. If Israel escalates to restore deterrence without understanding the limits of its logistics and air defense, it may deepen the crisis. If Washington enters directly believing it can punish Iran without triggering a wider war, it may discover that the escalation ladder is not under American control. If media narratives continue to hide battlefield reality behind slogans, the public will not understand the danger until the consequences are already here. The battlefield has delivered its message. The question now is whether the people making decisions are disciplined enough to hear it, or whether arrogance, propaganda, intelligence failure, and bad policy will push the region into a war no one can control.